Alleluia. Om Mani Padme Om. Allah Satnam.
Welcome. You're watching RMIT University. And today we're speaking with Cahill, Professor of Intercultural Studies at RMIT University. Thanks for coming in, Des.
Thank you, Norm.
Look forward to this. This will be some very interesting topics we'll cover. Before we get to that, though, can you give us a bit of a background of how you're at this place right now? You were a priest, I believe, in the past.
Well, the story of my life is summed up in the phrase from priest to professor. And I was born in Bendigo, in central Victoria, from rural, quintessentially Irish Catholic Australian stock. Family had come from Ireland in the late 1860s during the Great Irish Migration to Australia, and took up land on my mother's side, outside Heathcote, and then my father came from outside Mildura. Right. And so farming is very much written into the DNA of the Cahill family. But then I was born a few weeks before the end of World War II, and while my father, who was with the RAAF, was flying around New Guinea, and then he was a primary school teacher, so we moved around different parts of Victoria. And then in the 1953, basically for our education, we came to Melbourne, and he took up various posts in primary schools around Melbourne. And so we initially were in Preston, and then we moved to Kew, and that's sort of where I spent most of all my secondary education.
Right.
At the Christian Brothers in East Melbourne. And then I immediately decided I was called to the priesthood, and that's what happened. So I spent 4 years here studying for the Catholic diocesan priesthood in Melbourne, and then I was asked to go to Rome. Each year a small number were chosen to go to Rome. So I was 3 years behind Cardinal George Pell. We have the same theological degree. And I did my theology from 1966 to 1970, which was, and this is important because it was immediately after the Second Vatican Council. Right. And interestingly enough, it's the same years that Pope Francis did his theology, 66 to 70, whereas those who'd gone through a few years earlier were subject to a much more conservative type of theology. The changes that were being brought in by the Vatican II theology had not quite yet touched certainly the academies, the pontifical academies in Rome.
Okay, so that was an interesting start. So where did that lead you when you came back to Australia? What did you?
Well, when I came back to Australia, I was obviously fluent in Italian, and so that meant that I was appointed to high-density migrant parishes.
Okay.
And so I started at North Altona in Melbourne's western suburbs in 1970. And a few weeks later, the Westgate Bridge fell down. Oh, right. And that was a very interesting time. In fact, I was there about 1 hour after it happened. Yes. And saw all these bodies strewn out on the road, each covered with a Hessian bag. And then I buried some of them because I was a chaplain to what's now the Westgate cemetery there in Altona North, Altona West. And then life moves on. 4 or 5 years later, I married some of the widows to new second partners. Right. So that was a very interesting time. Yes. And then I moved to Thornbury in Melbourne's northern suburbs. But then at that time I was starting to think about a number of issues in the church, and so I made the decision. It was a very difficult decision to leave the priesthood, and which I did in 1976. And so then, luckily, I found a research position at Monash University, looking at the integration of newly arrived immigrant families from Latin America, Great Britain and Malta. And so that was really the start of my career, which, in academic terms has been fairly successful.
And it's interesting because you're Professor of Intercultural Studies. That intercultural component of it started very early in your priesthood, didn't it? It sort of led through from there.
It's been the theme right throughout my life, I suppose. Both, migration and the consequences of migration.
Yes.
Because I'd sort of gone through that same experience when I was settling into Rome, because I had to learn Italian, and being in a very different environment. Obviously, I was in a protected environment, living in a seminary and supported environment, but nonetheless, I had some understanding of the adaptation process that immigrants and refugees go through.
Yes.
And so I knew that at a very existential level, working in a parish. And it was, I remember walking into homes during the SEC electricity strike back there in the early 70s, when families didn't have any money, they didn't have even a loaf of bread. So, that was a very real experience of poor migrant families being subject to the whims of trade union leaders and governments and so on, and the precariousness of their situation. So that led into obviously how to learn a second language, cross-cultural communication, how ethnic minority young people, and that's my academic interest in those topics then flowed on from that existential experience, which I think was important. I have a view that there are too many academics who have become professional students, in the sense that they went from undergraduate to postgraduate and then remained in the university system and didn't get their hands dirty.
Yeah. It's called the ivory tower syndrome.
Yes.
And there's another ivory tower which is called time, and we're out of that for the moment. We'll be back in a moment. Welcome back. You're watching Harmony University, and we're speaking with Professor Des Cahill. He's Professor of Intercultural Studies at RMIT University. Des, the introduction was very much led you into that place of having that intercultural awareness in so many different nuances. How did that lead into your life? What happened then? Where did that take you?
Well, I forgot to mention that I'd also begun training as a psychologist.
Oh, okay.
Okay,
Yeah.
so I classify myself as an educational and cross-cultural psychologist, which is at the core of my academic training, although I've never ever taught psychology or acted as a registered psychologist. So that's been another theme throughout my life. But obviously, with the interest in immigration, and as the multicultural social policy came onto the agenda in the late 70s and into the early 80s, I was very much part of that. And I met a lot of opposition, particularly within universities, from left-wing academics, surprisingly, who felt that it was a term that was being used by the right wing to cover up the situation of the proletariat, being offered as a sop to the proletariat. So that was very interesting. And I think, just to diverge somewhat, I think the multicultural agenda that we developed subsequently throughout the 1980s, that led to the 1989 National Agenda on a Multicultural Australia, which for me is still the core document in Australia. And because it was passed in a bipartisan move in Parliament,
Yes.
and I think that was very important. And even though there's been a few changes along the way and different emphases, particularly in the last, really since 9/11, with the emphasis on social cohesion in Australia, nonetheless, the seeds for that were sown in the late 70s and right throughout the 80s. And when you compare Australia with a country like France, now France's problem at the moment, as I see it, is that neither the academic nor the political left or right ever developed the notion of a multicultural France, even though they had been taking in immigrants, especially from the French colonies, such as Vietnam. There's a significant Vietnamese community in Paris, Toulouse, and so on. And then, of course, the Algeria and other places in the Middle East. And they are still marginalised within the French context, and I think this is one of the reasons behind the problems that France is having with radicalisation and so on, which is not to suggest that Australia doesn't have problems, but I don't think they're of the same magnitude. And just like America, the Muslim population in America is quite middle class, and you haven't had quite the same problems there as they've had in France.
So would you, because Australia is often lauded, and Sydney and Melbourne particularly, as the multicultural hubs in many ways.
Yes.
Do you think that's a reasonable description? Is it more successful than anywhere else in the world, the multicultural drive in Australia?
Oh, I don't know about anywhere else in the world. I think one has to be careful about phrases like that. But I think that we have been relatively successful in integrating a very wide variety of people. And it's been a gradual process. And I think it's been a very good example of social engineering, mainly through the immigration department, from the late 1940s right through until now, although I think the immigration department has been caught up in the whole border security ideology, which has not been especially helpful.
No.
But I think that's been counterbalanced by that we now recognise ourselves as a culturally, linguistically and religiously diverse Australia. And I suppose my interest in the interfaith movement and my chairship of Religions for Peace Australia and so on, that's been a natural flow on from the notion of a multicultural Australia.
Right. Yeah, something else that's been a natural flow on is a number of restaurants in Melbourne of all those sorts of persuasions. It's quite amazing, isn't it?
It is amazing.
Quite amazing. Now,
and that was a gradual process, and I think that when you look at, say, Tasmania, which hasn't had that gradual process, although there were immigrants there during the 50s. They weren't in the number they were in Victoria and New South Wales, and Queensland was similar. That was Brisbane was very Anglo until the late 80s.
Yes, it's quite amazing, because particularly if you take places like the Dandenong City Council area, I think it's 52 or 57 different ethnic groups in that area, and you only need to go there to see that.
Yes.
And yet it appears to be a reasonably successful social experiment.
Yes, and we haven't had, certainly the ghettos we haven't had. We may have some ethnic enclaves where there may be a concentration of a certain group, whether it's the Jews in St Kilda and Hawthorn or the Turks in Broadmeadows and Meadow Heights and so on, or the Maltese in North Sunshine and Cahill and so on. But that it's been a diluted concentration and hasn't caused any problems.
No, it's quite amazing. But and this is a question which will lead into our next segment, so I probably shouldn't ask it, but I will anyway. is these young people off the end of this, the youth. Now you have an interest in that, don't you?
Yes.
And how has that manifested itself? What do you do in relation to intercultural activities with
young people?
Yeah.
Oh, I suppose I'm dealing all the time with my students who are coming from different ethnic backgrounds. But my interest really came because during the 80s we had a multicultural studies course that I ran, but we also had the first youth work course in Australia.
Now, as I said, I shouldn't have asked the question. We'll need to go to a break, but we'll come right back to it. We'll be back in a moment.
Allah. Alleluia.
Welcome back. You're watching Harmony University, and we're speaking with Des Cahill, Professor Intercultural Studies, RMIT University. And Des, I interrupted you there with the break, and you were just saying that just being a lecturer and a professor at university is a multicultural experience in its own right. That's led you into having an interest in young people, hasn't it? How does that manifest itself?
Well, obviously, during my pastoral work as a priest, I was interested in young people and had a few youth clubs along the way.
Oh, okay.
But then, when I was at Phillip Institute of Technology, which then became RMIT, joined in, amalgamated with RMIT, there was a youth work course, the first one in Australia, and I worked alongside them because I was in charge of the Multicultural Studies program. And so we had some joint research enterprises, beginning with the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet, because no one had the expertise or the interest in ethnic minority youth. So it was quite unique to have that expertise, people on the same campus, in fact, in the same building. And so we did some major studies in the late 80s and early 90s on ethnic minority youth. And I can remember writing a report for the Commonwealth Government in 1992, I think it was, where I was focusing on issues of identity, accommodation, income support, and even housing affordability, because I could see even then that it was going to be very difficult for newly arrived refugees in particular to eventually own a house in the suburbs of Melbourne. And of course that's become exacerbated in the last 20 years.
Yeah, it certainly has. Now, of course, there's the elephant in the room with that is the religions of these individuals. How does that manifest itself? They've got all these other issues that you're addressing, but they're isolated sometimes in relation to their religion as well.
Yes, well, I think there are various types of reacting to that religious transition, because they may have come from heavily Catholic or Orthodox or Muslim or Buddhist countries, and how that transitions is a very interesting issue, because even their parents may be wanting to get away from a strict adherence to that religious culture. Others want to keep it very strongly, and it tends to vary from group to group. For example, when we studied the Latin Americans, there was quite a percentage of that who didn't want to have anything more to do with the Catholic Church, whereas there are others who were very committed, and it became a crutch for them. One of my students, Sue Ennis, is just about to publish her PhD thesis on religion, spirituality, and the refugee experience. And she documents how at each stage of the refugee experience, both in the country when it was in chaos and they wanted to get out, and that was often dangerous, of course, then in the refugee camp or on the streets of a particular city in Europe or the Middle East or wherever, and then coming to Australia and the hassles and difficulties of adapting to this new environment called Australia. Religion helped them at every stage. Right. And so that's, religion is, is often a very vital support, because it also provides a sense of belonging in Australia, perhaps to the group that's already here, but often they'll join together with their own ethno-religious communities to provide that psychological support, that feeling of solidarity of people who have been through or are going through the same adaptation process. Yes. And that's why the broader ethnic communities are also important in that.
As far as religious discrimination, have you come across that in a very severe way, or is it fairly moderate within Australia?
No, a few years ago in 2011, some of us did a project for the Human Rights Commission where we looked at freedom of religion and freedom of belief in 21st century Australia. And I mean, what we found is that, I mean, generally there are no serious problems, but there were a few findings that came out of that. One, because we did it partly through talking to religious and other community leaders, and then through a submission process. And we advertised in the daily papers. We thought we would get about 500 submissions. We got over 2,000 submissions. So it was a task to condense that into a readable volume. I mean, the basic thing that we found was that the phobia against Muslims and against gay people was very strong, and that was coming through in some of these unfortunate submissions that were coming in to our inquiry. So we've documented all that. I suppose the other thing that came out of that study was, as we talked to religious leaders, we sense that they don't have a well thought out position on the separation of religion and state, and they don't have a thought out position on how religion and religious diversity in a multi-faith society should be managed and governed by the state.
Yeah, and that creates all sorts of myopic sort of behaviour there, doesn't it?
It does, because it comes out in things like the role of religious law vis-a-vis the civil and criminal law. And that's come up in a number of major issues in recent years.
Absolutely, and then we go on to Sharia law and all sorts of stuff, but we're actually out of time, and this is an ongoing conversation. Next week, could we speak again, please, Des? That'd be really good.
Okay, thank you, Norm. Happy to come back.
Thanks very much. We'll be back next week. Thanks for watching, and we'll be speaking with Des Cahill. Bye for now.
Baha'u'llah, Shanti Om, Allahu